Well, good morning, and thank you all for being here today. I think the title of my talk in the booklet is Western Perspectives in Curriculum, and I really wanted today to look a little bit at the cross-curriculum priorities in the national curriculum, to look a bit at the history of the development of those priorities, and to consider what a Western civilization perspective or priority would look like in a curriculum setting. So I hope to be able to achieve those things in this talk today. But I want to begin my talk by thinking about the 137th Psalm, which famously recounts the longing of Jewish exiles in Babylon after the destruction of Jerusalem. As an exiled people, they feared that their exile would lead to the disappearance of their distinct religious and cultural identity. The psalmist proclaimed that if I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, or let my tongue cleave to my mouth, if I remember you not, if I prize not Jerusalem above all my joys. The psalmist understood that memory is an essential feature of identity. If the exiled Jews forgot about the temple in Jerusalem and their religious and cultural life in Judah, then they would cease to exist meaningfully as a people. The final verse of the psalm reads, "Happy shall be he be who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock," in relation to the Babylonian children. It's a contentious verse, given that it seems to call for the killing of the children of the victorious Babylonians in revenge. In the post-Vatican II breviary and missal, the verse has actually been removed. The verse speaks to the devastating distress that the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple had on the Jews of that time. However, it conflicts with our understanding of human dignity and the right to life and the innocence of children. But as a literary expression, it reveals the depth of despair that can be experienced when a people see their identities and cultures endangered. Over the past 2 decades, discourse over the Australian curriculum has often left defenders of Australia's Western patrimony in a state of despair. For many, there is a real sense that future generations of Australians are losing their memory of Australia's Western cultural foundations. There is a concern that this core feature of Australia is neglected or not held up in the education system. While there are dialogues about developing a national curriculum in a few key learning areas during Howard's last term, which, if you want to feel old, actually began 20 years ago this year, it was the Rudd-Gillard government that developed and put into reality the concept of an Australian curriculum. Fundamentally, the curriculum functions as a cultural document for how its creators want young Australians to think and feel about their country. What I will argue is that this national curriculum, through its cross-curriculum priorities, distorts the place of the Western patrimony. The Rudd-Gillard government oversaw a general movement towards federal influence in education. NAPLAN tests are the main example, and they've led to some good things, such as the use of phonics being broadly supported by education ministers across the political spectrum. But the national curriculum itself is another aspect of that. It does encounter the difficulties of state and federal relations, and even though there is a national curriculum, which is outlined very clearly on the website of ACARA, it's still implemented by the state. So in Victoria, it's slightly different to how it's implemented in New South Wales, for example. So it's not quite correct to say that Australia has one national curriculum, but the national curriculum in a way works as a template which the states then put into practice in their own arenas. The first version of the national curriculum, and every subsequent one, recognised 3 cross-curriculum priorities. Most of us have probably heard of them before. They are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures, Asia and Australia's engagement with Asia, and sustainability. The original version of the curriculum contained 7 traditional disciplines, 7 capabilities, in addition to those 3 priorities. The cross-curriculum priorities were supposed to provide, according to some scholars, a futures orientation for Australian students, trying to mould the mentality of what the adult Australians of tomorrow would think and feel about the country, how they would project themselves into the world. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander History's priority seeks to enable students, and this is a quote, to engage in reconciliation, respect and recognition of the world's oldest continuous living cultures. And that's the end of the quote. Most disciplines are expected to incorporate that priority in some way. It's been argued by some scholars that the Indigenous priority impresses on Australians the significance of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as an anchor in a reconciled nation state. The Indigenous people of the Australian continent and their culture is presented as an essential feature of Australian life, and in order to be a modern Australian, you need to have a deep understanding of that culture. The second priority is Asia and Australia's engagement with Asia, and it explicitly highlights the growing significance of Asia economically and locates the reconciled nation state aimed at by the first priority in the Asian economic region. Some of the key concepts in the priority include the past and continuing achievements of the peoples of Asia and the past and ongoing economic cultural links between Asia and Australia. So there's an explicit expectation that the cultures of Asia will be held up and valued in the curriculum. Australian students are therefore encouraged to see their future in an Asian geographic world. Australia is conceptualised as a nation on an ancient continent with the ongoing culture of its first people as the foundation of the nation. Australia is then positioned to look outward and embrace its geography in Asia. Finally, the sustainability priority seeks to promote an understanding of the environment and all of those sorts of things as essential to collective well-being, and obviously that emerges from the politics of the environmental movement. The future that these priorities put forward for Australia is one that's reconciled with its Indigenous people, one that has fully embraced its economic and geographic ties to Asia, and one that moves away from environmental destruction to living in an integrated way with the environment. What's completely missing from those priorities is an understanding of Australia as a nation with a Western patrimony, not just as a feature, but as its core foundation. The sense that these priorities totally ignore this foundational feature of Australia has been at the heart of criticisms of the national curriculum since its inception. And conservative politicians and commentators have largely been the ones who have led this critique. So, for example, while there were lots of issues that led to the defeat of the Rudd-Gillard government in 2013, under the radar, this issue of the national curriculum was definitely present in a lot of public discourse about politics at the time. And in some ways they were a continuation of what were wrongly called the history wars during the Howard era. Because Howard had always shown an interest in the teaching of history, and he'd hoped that his own government would create a national curriculum where the imbalances that he felt existed in the academic world could be addressed. He adopted more the three cheers approach that was defined by Geoffrey Blaney over the black armband approach, which was also defined by Geoffrey Blaney. Howard would always speak about the importance of addressing the blemishes of Australia's past as well. But when he read the new national curriculum, he called it something that was unbalanced, lacking in priorities and quite bizarre. And he argued that it downplayed the Judeo-Christian ethic and ignored Australia's Western heritage. ACARA, the curriculum body at the time, was obviously disturbed enough by this intervention that they actually released a statement going through all the different content descriptors in the curriculum that addressed Howard's criticisms. And they argued that Australia's Judeo-Christian and Western heritage was actually addressed in the curriculum. ACARA said their influences on Australian culture and our legal practice and political systems are clearly dealt with. And I think teachers who know the curriculum well can probably attest that they are dealt with, but the curriculum is not framed around the idea that Australia has a Western foundation. It's framed around the ideas of the cross-curriculum priorities that I mentioned before. Tony Abbott also singled out changes to the history curriculum in the lead up to the 2013 election. He called it too left-leaning. He did, once he came into power, put in place a review led by Kevin Donnelly, and that review didn't recommend getting rid of the cross-curriculum priorities, but it did talk about the need to rebalance the curriculum and to ensure that, I guess, a Western perspective was adequately addressed and included. But that kind of didn't occur after the removal of Abbott and the arrival of Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister. The move to really improve the curriculum seemed to lose steam. It didn't seem to be in interest of the Turnbull government. There are some more recent versions of the national curriculum that came out under Alan Tudge, the last Education Minister in the previous coalition government. And there certainly were some improvements, but what's really clear is that the cross-curriculum priorities have quite thoroughly established themselves, or have been quite thoroughly established as a part of the educational landscape. So textbooks, resources, all incorporate them in some way where appropriate. Teachers are used to planning across the years in their curriculum planners to incorporate the priorities. So they're really well established in Australia, and I think the reality is that they're not going to go away anytime soon. Although I know that in certainly some independent and classical schools that might be formed, you would expect that without needing national directives, you'll definitely have a strong priority and emphasis on Western civilisation in the curriculum. So the importance, I think, going forward is thinking about what would it look like if Australia had a fourth cross-curriculum priority that tried to embed the theme of the Western patrimony in its curriculum and would connect young Australians with that part of their past and have them understand that that's an essential feature of Australian identity. And that's what I'm hoping to do in this next section of the talk. Okay. So each of the three priorities that I've mentioned, if you go to the Australian Curriculum website, they're built around normally 10 or 12 key organising ideas. So each, if you go to the Indigenous one or the Australia's engagement with Asia one, there's a list of ideas that are supposed to frame the inclusion of that theme across the curriculum. So what I am going to do is go through some of the Indigenous Australian organising ideas, and I'm going to suggest how a Western perspective organising idea might be written as an equivalence. So the first organising idea for the Indigenous cross-curriculum priority is that Australia has two distinct Indigenous groups, Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders, and within those groups there is significant diversity. My initial attempt to write a Western perspective equivalent to that is as follows. The Australian colonies were founded by Great Britain, and as a result, a British and more broadly Western culture is foundational to Australian society. The early settler population of Australia was largely English, Scottish, Welsh and Irish. Later, a variety of European peoples have made Australia their home, full stop. The second Indigenous organising idea is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities maintain a special connection and responsibility for country and place. My suggested Western equivalent is Australia now has a culturally heterogeneous population. However, an appreciation of British and European culture is vital in order to understand Australian culture, language, history and political structure. The third Indigenous organising idea is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have holistic belief systems and are spiritually and intellectually connected to land, sea, sky and waterways. My suggested equivalent to that is that the predominantly British and European settlers of Australia from 1788 to the end of the 19th century brought with them belief systems largely informed by Christianity and the social and political ideals informed by the Enlightenment. An appreciation of both of these systems is vital for understanding modern Australia. The fourth organising idea, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander societies have many language groups. My suggestion is Western culture contains a variety of linguistic and cultural expressions. It is not monolithic. Another organising idea is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples live in Australia as the first peoples of the country or place and demonstrate resilience in responding to historic and contemporary impacts of colonisation. My suggested equivalent is Australians of settler background are descendants of the earliest waves of European settlement in Australia. The project of settling, building and developing the United Australian Federation was a significant achievement. These achievements can be explored across the domains of English, the arts, the humanities and science. Finally, organising idea 9 says the significant contributions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the present and past are acknowledged locally, nationally and globally. And I've said the significant contributions of other Australians in the present and past are acknowledged locally, nationally and globally. So they're just some suggestions for how you could write organising ideas that uphold a Western civilisation perspective in the curriculum. Okay. Moving on to how such a priority might work in particular disciplines. In English, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander priority calls for students to appreciate literature created by First Nations Australians and illustrators, and to engage with and respond to the literature about the histories, cultures and perspective of First Nations Australians. In the Australia and Asia priority, it calls for students to explore texts and reflect the rich and diverse cultures and belief systems and traditions of the Asia region and Asian experiences in and with Australia. And finally, the sustainability priority calls for students to explore how ideas and opinions about issues such as social justice and living sustainably can be represented in texts from different historical and social contexts. So these are just the English-specific guidelines or suggestions for implementing the cross-curriculum priorities. What we can see here is that across the year levels and curriculum planners will feel the need to incorporate texts that are connected to that priority. Strictly speaking, and the review from Kevin Donnelly about 10 years ago made this clear, strictly speaking, you don't have to address these priorities every year in the curriculum. Therefore, it doesn't mean that schools can't select texts from what we might call the Western canon, or that present a more positive perspective on the history of the West. But it does lead to, when you sit down and organise a curriculum, you see these two priorities written down in front of you and you sort of know that that's the first thing that you have to do. And so it puts further down on the cab rank, so to speak, the Western text, and means that they don't necessarily get the fair hearing that they are entitled to. Okay. Consequently, it will be beneficial to have these explicit elaborations that encourage the adoption of a Western perspective in the curriculum across the year levels. Each year level from Foundation to Year 10 has its own description, and while the wording varies slightly, the Year 8 version is a good example. The Year 8 level description reads as follows, and I quote, The range of literary texts for Foundation to Year 10 comprises the oral narrative traditions and literature. That's me timing myself to not go too long. The range of literary texts for Foundation to Year 10 comprises the oral narrative traditions and literature of First Nations Australians and classic and contemporary literature from wide-ranging Australian and world authors, including texts from and about Asia. We can see from this wording that the curriculum planners are encouraged across their planning to first of all attempt to include, where possible, text relating to Aboriginal Australians. Secondly, and this is where ACARA would have been coming out against Howard in 2012, they do say that you need to incorporate classic and contemporary literature, and it calls for the frequent study of Australian texts. And while discussing Australian world authors, it makes clear that Asia should be the source of some of that literature. So it does say that you need to incorporate classic literature, but it doesn't it doesn't state that it needs to be from the Western canon, for example. So you could easily construct a 7 to 10 English course without something from a Western canon if you didn't want to. Most schools do, but that's clear from the actual wording of the statement. So even though Shakespeare texts remain pretty common in Australian classrooms, I think that example sort of shows that we do need to be more explicit about the need to incorporate texts with the Western patrimony. Just giving time, I won't talk about science, but in the chapter that I put into the book, I have a section just looking at how the cross-curriculum priorities have been implemented in science and some sort of classroom ideas for how they could be used by teachers if you wanted to incorporate a Western perspective. But in a classroom setting, just focusing on English, if we took the example of a Year 10 class, if we were to have a Western civilisation priority in curriculum and the Year 10 English teachers met to organise their course for the year, and they knew that they had all these different elaborations that they needed to meet. They know that they need to cover First Nations perspectives at some stage, and they'd missed that at Year 9 just because of curriculum crowding. So as a result, they select as their first text for the year Sally Morgan's My Place, which is a novel about an Indigenous woman who returns to her birthplace and reconnects with her culture. That would be a way they could tick off the Indigenous cross-curriculum priority. In Year 9, they'd studied a collection of texts known as Growing Up Asian in Australia, so they therefore know that they don't need to do something for the Asian priority in Year 10. But as they think about what their second text might be, and they see that they now need to implement a Western perspective priority, a lot of them wouldn't know what that means at first, but they do some research and they find that it means they could study anything from a Greek play, a Norse legend, a Shakespeare text, or a Victorian novel. So they select Macbeth because they think it will interest the boys in the class. In the study of the text, they learn about the history of the English language and how literature and drama in the Elizabethan era has informed later art forms. So if you have explicit directives in curriculum, teachers tend to make the best of them. Okay. So in conclusion, I started this talk referencing the 137th Psalm. The desire to retain a memory of one's patrimony, even in an ever-changing world, is something that all peoples should be able to understand. In fact, the construction of the Indigenous priority in the curriculum stems from a well-intentioned desire to include Aboriginal culture in the nation's sense of self. But what I've explored in this paper, and perhaps in a bit more detail in the book chapter, is how a Western perspective priority might draw out more explicitly in curriculum respect for Australia's Western foundations, and understanding that being a citizen of Australia means that one is a part of the ongoing drama of Western civilisation. So I think that's really the desire that I would have with such a priority. But I'll leave it there, and hopefully there are a few minutes for some questions. But thank you for listening so diligently and attentively. Thank you.